Greg Epstein serves as the Humanist Chaplain at Harvard University and is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, Ducking People Walking By, which is, no, that's not the name of it. He is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, Good Without God, What a Billion Non-Religious People Do Believe. He sits on the executive committee of the 36-member Harvard Chaplains Corps. His next book, The Godless Congregation, with co-author James Croft, will be published by Simon & Schuster in 2015. Please welcome Greg Epstein.
Oh, it's clergy morning at the Secular Student Alliance. Whoever, I mean, it's a whole themed morning of clergy at the Secular Student Alliance. I'm a little frightened. Just remember, I want you to keep in mind, my mother did say that she wanted me to be the first Jewish televangelist. But, you know, if you're making any comparisons, you're drawing any lines from Jerry to myself, just remember, I am a rabbi. There is a difference. There might be a slightly different cadence, I'm not sure. But I am a rabbi, but unlike Jerry, I was ordained as an atheist. I was ordained in a ceremony in which there was no prayer to God, in which the Torah scroll was in the next room in the library, in which, in front of the congregation, as the ceremony was taking place, instead of any sort of Torah scroll or sacred objects or whatever, there was a beautiful sculpture carved out of wood. It's a Hebrew word. The word is Adam, and that word means humanity in Hebrew. And in traditional rabbinic ordinations, one rabbi will lay the hands on the head of another rabbi, and instead, the person that was in charge of the program that I got ordained through gave me a hug. So, it's a little different. But I had to do about 5 years of study, and I had to get fluent in Hebrew and fluent in Aramaic in order to do this. So, I think it was pretty real. And I'm one of this group of folks that the SSA has deemed fit to invite to a conference like this, that we are ordained and we're leading, we're facilitating, we are helping to build communities where you might find some structures that might remind you of some structures that you've seen in religious congregations. And this might be disconcerting to some. It was certainly disconcerting to me the first time I ever heard of it. Because I chose to get into this as somebody that, you know, I was an agnostic atheist on a good day who, you know, had never ever considered working in a community, being clergy, anything like that, until I found out about humanism and secularism and a movement of atheists and agnostics and such people. So I thought this was a little bizarre when I first discovered it, but what I ultimately decided was, if community is good for people, and I'm going to argue to you that it is, then why are we going to give it up such that only religious people can do it in a way that works for them? It can work for us. We can put it to work for us. So I want to talk really just quickly about 3 points regarding community. We're not going to answer all the questions you might have about it. James, my co-author, and myself are going to write a book about this. We just signed the contract, so we've got a little bit of time to write it. So this is a beginning of a conversation. And as you can tell from those of you who saw Jerry today, this is a movement that is just beginning. And I want to say people like Jerry are going to take us a long way. Does he or does he not have a bright future in front of him? And there are many, many more, too. I mean, we've got a person like Mike Ouse, who's leading a very similar community, or founding a very similar community in Houston called the Houston Oasis. There's a couple of professional comedians out in London named Sanderson and Pippa, who have started something called the Sunday Assembly, which is basically the same kind of community, only it's being run by comedians instead of clergy people. So that might be a positive development, I'm not sure. But as a beginning, I just want to answer 3 questions or discuss 3 questions with you about community. the first question is, what don't I mean? What don't we mean by community building? I think that needs to be discussed. The second question that I want us to discuss today is, what do we mean by community building, obviously? And the third question that I want to discuss with you today, especially given that we're at the Secular Student Alliance, is, if the future is now, what about the future of the future? But let me get to what we're not doing when we're building community. What don't I mean by building community? So there are 5 things that I want you to keep in mind that community, I think when folks like myself, or at least when I'm talking about it, what community is not. Community is not a faith. It's not a religion. It's not a church. It's not a denomination. And finally, it's not Starbucks. Okay, but let me say a little bit more about what I mean by each of those 5. So, it's not a faith, what we're talking about here. Not even what Jerry was doing, although I was one of his faithful, absolutely. And I want to say here that I'm willing to contradict one of perhaps my favorite humanists in the world, certainly one of my favorite humanist celebrities, Joss Whedon, who you may know from his shows like Buffy and their strong female characters, or directing The Avengers, which doesn't have such strong female characters. Joss Whedon, when he came to Harvard to speak about being a humanist and how his work, all of his body of work, has been motivated by his humanist values, said to us, faith in God means believing absolutely in something with no proof whatsoever. But faith in humanity means believing absolutely in something with a huge amount of proof to the contrary. We are the true believers. And so, Joss was basically suggesting that there is a definition of the word faith by which we don't necessarily need to get sick about if somebody were to want to refer to us and what we're doing as a faith. We don't need to let it tear us up inside if somebody wants to refer to us that way. But what we're doing is not a faith. And I've said as much in interfaith gatherings in front of thousands of people that were attending interfaith gatherings while I was on stage with some of the most prominent interfaith leaders in the country, if not the world, some of whom I consider true friends. It's not a faith. What we're doing is not a faith. And it's not because the concept of faith in definitions like Joss's is such a terrible, terrible concept. It's because the word faith, when it's used in that context, when it's used in most of America today, is basically just a euphemism for religion. The word faith is being used in the context in which it is because religious people decided that religion isn't such a great word to use. They're actually not all that proud of it all the time because they know there are plenty of people like you who have really legitimate criticisms of a lot of what religion is. And so they call it a faith instead because that word sounds friendlier. That's the case. And so what we're doing is not a faith because the popular definition of faith, just like the popular definition of religion, involves things like gods and supernatural stuff, miracles, etc., that we are just not about. And it's not a religion. Even though, to be honest with ourselves, this movement that we're part of, that we're promoting, that we're dedicating much of our lives to, was actually founded by quite a few people who did, in fact, identify what they were doing as a religion for them, as their religion. In fact, many of them were clergy. The origins of the movement that birthed this conference and this organization, it goes back to a movement of people that actually call themselves religious humanists, many of whom were Christian clergy, a couple rabbis as well, in the late 19th, early 20th century, who were learning about science, who were learning about evolution, who were learning about biblical criticism, and who decided, I can't believe this stuff anymore. They were the Jerrys of that day. But they didn't have this movement available to them, so they had to come up with, they didn't want to just stop doing what they were doing. They liked the part that was helping a congregation, helping people to see the world as a more meaningful place, to make the world a better place through active work towards justice and what have you. And so they got together, some of them, and they said, we need to come up with a name for what we're going to do. And they decided that the word humanism was the name that they liked the best at that point. And so they actually said, humanism is going to be our religion, even though it didn't involve anything supernatural from their point of view. And so you had this movement, and that went on for several decades into the second half of the 20th century until an organization called the Center for Inquiry was founded by some folks who said, no, we can't call ourselves a religion anymore. We got to call what we're doing secular humanism because that's clear. Until, of course, the Secular Student Alliance essentially, I wouldn't say completely broke away from this, but there were some roots in common. The Secular Student Alliance had some folks working for it at its very beginnings that were involved with the Center for Inquiry, which at that time, and I'm not saying anything about its current leadership, but at that time, it was actually being a little authoritarian, a little dogmatic about who could do this and who can call themselves that. And so we broke away because it was a little too religious for us at the Center for Inquiry. And so now, you, the students, we, the folks who are building this movement, all of us, get to call it whatever we want. Because the folks who came before us screwed up a little bit, which is, by the way, what folks who came before us tend to do. And we in this room, all of us, will one day be the folks who came before us to some other folks. So let's try to be a little sensitive. The folks who came before us screwed up a little bit. And so now we get to call this thing whatever we want. You want to call it humanism, atheism, agnosticism, free thought, secularism, skepticism, cynicism, apatheism, agnosticism. You pick.
Epistemism.
There you go. Epistemism, whatever. It's sort of like the LGBT movement, or is that the GLBT movement, or is it the queer movement, or the LGBT? See, those guys can't even get their acronym straight. And yet, we all know they have a movement, and so do we. It's not a religion. And it's not a church, by the way. I mean, you can call it a church out of convenience. But I like to point out that by calling what we're doing in setting up communities churches, we're kind of implying that you have to be coming from a Christian cultural background in order to join. When in fact, I think that we want to invite people of all different religious and non-religious backgrounds to join the communities that we're going to form. So it's not a church, it's not a synagogue, it's not a mosque, it's not a temple. It's just not. And of course, the media is going to love, especially in the United States of America, the media is going to love to call it a church. So sometimes we just have to get used to that. I got to say, we were talking about our community in Boston to some folks at CNN recently, and we did this long interview with them. A few times we interviewed with them. Hours and hours, just like Jerry and all these other congregations are doing. People are really focusing their attention. So we talked to CNN, and we said about a dozen times, if not more, it's not a church, it's not a church, it's not a church. And what did we get? That when the headline ran at CNN, it was a big article, it was called, "Church Without God by Design." All right. So the point is, it's sort of exactly the opposite of what we were hoping for. But on the other hand, the coverage of the story of the fact that we were trying to build meaningful community to help people and to make a better world, that part of the story was quite good. And so my question to you is, I've been through this once or twice. I've been down this block, and so will you have eventually if you stick with this. And so what should I have done? When CNN came to me, I knew they were going to do the church story, and I told them a dozen times that it's not a church. I knew they were going to say it anyway, so what should I have said? Oh, I refuse, good sir. I refuse to talk to you. I refuse. I will not speak to you anymore. Good day, sir. I said good day. Is that the approach that we should take when somebody comes to interview us about a community? No. It's not a church, but we don't have to be overly sensitive about it. It's not a denomination. We're not trying to go out and create communities in a very, rigid way where everybody has to do exactly what Jerry does, or exactly what I do, or exactly what you do, or exactly what anybody does. All we're trying to do is build something relentlessly positive, something that improves lives, something where if somebody else before us had a good idea, we're not going to reject that idea just because they also had a bad idea along with it. And it's not Starbucks. You know, people say to me, oh, Greg, you're talking about working to spread humanistic, secular communities or congregations or whatever you want to call them around the country. Is it going to be like Starbucks? Is it a cookie cutter model? I say, no. It's not like Starbucks. It's like the cafe. I mean, in this movement, up until recent years, for most of us, we didn't even have the equivalent of the concept of the cafe. Right? Imagine you're walking down the street in whatever city you're from, and you're thinking to yourself, it'd be really nice to go into some place, you know, open the door right now, walk into some place where I could get a stimulating, tasty beverage, and maybe they'd have like a pastry or two, and there'd be a table, and I could spread out my laptop, and I'd get some work done, and maybe meet somebody cute or whatever. But no, that thing doesn't exist. We don't even have the cafe unless we build it. And that's what we're doing. So what do we mean by community building? First of all, you've got to have some beliefs. You've got to have some principles if you're going to build a positive community. And our communities are going to have positive principles just like any others. I won't get into all of them because it's not the kind of thing where you have to obey one rule after another rule after another rule, 613 commandments or whichever number your culture of origin abides by. Just 3 quick principles. Number 1, we acknowledge reality as it is in our communities, meaning God is a literary character, and it's up to us to write better literature. That's all. I mean, that's the kind of we just have to acknowledge reality for what it is. It means that we're not just about rejecting God, we're also about rejecting the idea that we have to be so perfect, that we have to be so beautiful all the time in every single way, and words can't bring us down. You know, we have some secular myths too. And we acknowledge reality. We say, look, we're just trying to make reality a little bit better than it is because it could use it. You know, if you saw a verdict of a certain trial last night, you may agree with me that reality could use a little improving every now and then. And if we don't do it, then it's not going to happen. And the way to improve reality in a world in which there is no one single overarching purpose given to you by God. Nobody sat there from the sky and gave you a purpose. So what purpose might you choose? And I want to suggest that one of the best purposes we can choose is to connect truly and meaningfully with one another. And that is not, if you've ever tried it, you may agree, always an easy thing to do. And we can help one another. And we can come up with social technologies for helping one another. So, what does this community look like on a structural level? Because a community is about more than just beliefs. I don't want to know only what you believe. Just like you shouldn't want to know only what I believe. We should want to know what we do. What do you do to make the world a better place? What do you do to connect with people better? And, you know, there are really 5 structures of community that we're going to be looking at when we write this book, and that I just want to throw out there. The idea is, what do congregations really do when you look at it, when you strip out the literature? Well, you'll have some kind of gathering on a Sunday, or it might be a Friday or a Saturday if you're a member of my tribe. You'll have some kind of community service. You'll have some kind of education for kids, families, and also for adults. You know, people that want to get together in sort of small groups and figure out what a better life looks like, whether it's how to recover from an addiction, how to deal with grief, how to deal with a new stage of life. You'll have some kind of ceremonies, weddings, funerals, something for babies, something for meaningful days of the year. And you'll have some kind of political activism, and hopefully it's not anti-gay political activism. And hopefully it's not, let's pretend that there's no global climate change activism. Let's hope that it's some better form of activism that you and I can agree on, and that we might actually have plenty of religious allies on the liberal side of religious communities to agree with us on as well. In other words, be what I would call, what psychologists call, minimally counterintuitive. That's a fancy term for the fact that when psychologists tested all kinds of beliefs that either religious people have or that we could make up that people might suspect are religious. You know, if you say, well, we're gonna believe today in sleeping oak trees, you know, or I was gonna say, or if I were to say to you, you know, we're gonna believe today in sleeping oak trees that can fly through the sky and teleport to other dimensions and, you know, comb my hair. That's a little harder to believe in, and what we find is that people are more likely to be convinced by and to remember and to be influenced by a story about something that's minimally counterintuitive, like a guy that got bit by a spider, you know, or a guy that can fly. Or a guy that can fly and that movie's going to be a blockbuster. Even no, actually, that's not that believable. The Superman being no, that wasn't that great. Anyway, minimally counterintuitive. We take the ideas that have been influential, that have stuck with us, and if you've studied the history of religion, some of the ways that I have, you'll realize there are a lot of aspects of religion that went into the graveyards, that went completely into the dustbin of history. Oh, the religion that we celebrate now, that religious people celebrate now, they like to tell you that this is the tradition, that this is ancient history. And it's not. So much of the religious history just is no longer practiced because the ideas that stuck around till today, for the most part, were ideas that people found useful enough to keep around. And so those ideas that I talked to you about, the doing service, the getting out there and fighting for what you believe in, the gathering people together on Sunday if they want to gather. Not on Sunday morning, by the way. That's never going to work for me, and I doubt for you either. But not on a regular basis anyway. We made it here today, but I wouldn't recommend it every single week. We're going to do some of those things, and you can figure out for yourself how you might do them. Because you don't need me to tell you. If the idea is good enough, it'll work, regardless of what I think of it. And so the question then that it really comes down to is this question of the future maybe now. But what about the future of the future? And I say that in reference to this SSA slogan that I really like, which is that not only are secular students the future of the movement, but also the present, which is great. I mean, because you are. You are doing amazing work. And I want to say first to the SSA itself. Before I came to the conference yesterday, I flew in yesterday morning, and they were going to take me over to the conference, and I said, no. You need to take me over to the best thing in Columbus, Ohio first. And I asked them to take me to the SSA offices, which is, to me, the most beautiful thing in Columbus, Ohio. Because what you guys have built, August and Amanda helping out on Camp Quest and the humanist community of Central Ohio, what you guys have built is so beautiful to me. You have this big space and there's so many people and they're great, talented, inspired young people and they're working for a movement. They're building it. And they're doing it and we're bringing out the crowds and those crowds are going to the White House and they're going all over the world and they're making the case for a secularism that matters and a humanism that makes the world better. You're doing it. And when those guys move on to other jobs, some of these folks are going to take those offices and you're going to get bigger offices because you're going to hire twice as many of these guys. So the future is now, but what about the future of the future? Because you never think to yourself, well, all right, but in 5 years or 10 years, I'm not going to be a student anymore. And if this work that you're doing is meaningful to you, and I suspect it is because you're doing great work, it ought to be, then where are you headed in 5-10 years? Are you going to be the victims of some kind of bizarre reverse ageism where you're treated as irrelevant in 10 years by a bunch of kids who think Britney Spears is a grandma and they need to be reminded of what 9/11 was? No. We're going to need communities for everyone here well beyond the point at which we're students. So if we don't build godless congregations, what are we going to do? We've got to build these things. We've got to have places for all of us here in this room to go after we've finished being the present. We've got to be the future of the present. We've got to build twice as big a movement, which is going to mean twice or 3 times or 4 times as many jobs for those of you who love this and want to keep doing it for the rest of your life. It's going to mean twice or 3 or 4 times as much influence. When in 5 or 10 years from now, most Americans know somebody in the secular community because they're going to know about all the work that we're going to go out and do. So it's not a religion. It's not a church. It's not a denomination. It's not Starbucks. It's us. It's the book of us. It's our communities. We can build them. Thank you.